been designing and producing digital games in virtual worlds for nearly 20 years, from an early start building online games as a teenager. She's grown and managed many online communities, including a seminal multiplayer web game, Sissy Fight 2000. In the last decade, Naomi has collaborated on the design of a wide variety of educational and commercial titles at game studios such as Game Lab, Blue Fang, and Rebel Monkey. These projects include Mismanagement, which is part of the exhibition, the Facebook game Zoo Kingdom, and Game Star Mechanic, a project funded by the MacArthur Foundation that lets kids create games. Okay, thanks, Naomi.
Thank you very much. So now I'm actually going to just show you some pictures of games that I've worked on. Back when I started making games in the early 90s, I made games that looked like this. This was actually literally before we had graphics on the internet to play with, so everything was text. And so I had a very different experience making games than my early experience playing them. You know, I was in Japan when the Super Famicom came out, and as a kid, and so I had no idea. I was like, how would you actually go about making a game like that? There are big barriers to entry, but online I was able to sort of get into doing these text-based virtual worlds with friends when I was a teenager. Then I went on to work on this game Sissy Fight that Michelle also just mentioned, this is one of the first multiplayer games on the web. And this kind of sparked my interest in doing games that were really outside of the sort of traditional audience for games, you know, the kinds of Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Grand Theft Auto kind of games that you see in like big retail stores. So this game was actually, you know, originally designed for like New York, San Francisco hipsters, but turned out to have a huge following, both among kind of like the 17 magazine set. They did a big write-up on it, and then also the most enduring players turned out to be women in their 30s and 40s who were sort of playing it at home and really built a community around this that lasted many years. And then after that, I worked for a long time with Lego, doing games for kids. This is an example of a web game that I did for them. And then I went to work for a company called Game Lab, where we made casual games, which again was for this like surprisingly large, growing set of women, mostly in their 30s and 40s, who actually played a ton of games. And it's totally goes against the conventional wisdom, but 55% of game players are women. They play different, and the fastest growing segment still is sort of women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and sort of getting older all the time. So it's very different from how you see games portrayed in the mass media. This is Diner Dash. It's perhaps the best known game that we did at Game Lab. And kind of so these were called casual games. They were quick to play, very easy to learn, and you get them online instead of being distributed through stores usually. And then the game that I'm showing here, which you can play later, is called Mismanagement. It's kind of an evolution of that Diner Dash kind of gameplay. And the really cool thing about this company where I made this game, Game Lab, so we had an extremely diverse staff. It was more than half women. We had a lot of people of color. Thanks to some of the founders, we had a lot of folks who were working there who were from Korea, from South America, from a lot of different places. So we thought, we should actually try to reflect that in the game as well. So this game is about working in an office. It was kind of very inspired by the early seasons of The Office, especially the British version, which we watched a lot before playing this. So we thought, no one's done an office sitcom themed game. We're really up to now, why hasn't that been explored? So we thought we could do a lot of different, explore different themes in here about, this game is mostly about coworkers not getting along with each other, having personality clashes, and all having different sort of needs and quirks that you have to deal with in order to try and get work done in the office. And so we did things like, there's this girl who's sort of like a Sex and the City kind of stereotype, and she's actually kind of racist, and she like makes racist comments to some of the other characters. She thinks the Indian guy is a taxi driver. So again, it was like territory. They were like, why aren't games kind of like delving into this, and instead of dealing with these sort of more overt military like fantasy conflicts. And then I also worked on a bunch of other kinds of games that I'm different topics that I'm really excited to see represented here in this room. I've done some what we call games for change about social issues, and this is an educational game that was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. It's actually a tool set for kids to make their own games with. But then in the last year or so, the game industry is really dominated by games on Facebook. You probably have heard of games like Farmville or Cityville, or some of the fastest growing games in history. Cityville, I think, just reached earlier this year over 100 million players. And it's just kind of mind-boggling to those of us who are used to seeing like, oh, well, millions of players is amazing. But now they're up in the hundreds of millions. Never been games that have gotten this huge this quickly. So I've been also spending the last year or so making Facebook games. These are a couple of the games that I've worked on. And Facebook games are pretty, or social games as they're called, since there are other social networks besides Facebook, especially in other parts of the world. Social games are pretty controversial within the game industry. A lot of people see them as being kind of like a Skinner box. Like, you know, you put the player into this little box and you induce them to press this lever over and over again in order to get pellets. And, you know, this is, the behavioral psychology, you know, teaches us that this is a really good way of getting a rat addicted to pressing a lever, right? In fact, they'll just keep on pressing the lever even if you stop feeding them pellets for it. And, you know, so this business model seems to be built around, like, you know, getting people into this addictive mode. And so there's been a lot of criticism in the last couple of years about this model of gaming. And what a lot of people don't know is this kind of game where you play for free. That's one easy way to get 100 million players. And then you sort of pay for upgrades and advances to your gameplay, was pioneered in East Asia and really imported over here and turned into like a giant business model by companies like Zynga. And it's actually fueled a lot of the growth of Facebook too, since the game companies such as Zynga or Play-Doh are paying just, you know, millions and millions of dollars a week on a weekly basis to Facebook in order to promote their games. So I've been thinking about this a lot and thinking about, like, how do these kinds of games, why are these games so compelling? Can you really just get people to push a lever? And isn't there something a little bit deeper in terms of our psychology about what makes this stuff compelling? So people have been dividing games into these categories for a long time. I'm just sort of like now exposing you to like my pet ideas. I'm going to force on you, thank you. These are some really traditional categories for games, right? And they describe the central mechanic that really drives the game forward. You have to get lucky in order to win a game of chance, like roulette. You have to sort of develop your skill and have like a mastery of a certain set of talents, or really learn how to execute a strategy in order to play a game of skill or strategy. But this new breed of game, and, you know, I kind of went back and looked at the history, and there are a lot of games that really rely on time investment as the central thing that drives the game forward. So, you know, RPGs are a good example, and this is actually an interesting transition in the history of role-playing games from the sort of American-style role-playing game to the Japanese-style role-playing game, which you see represented by Final Fantasy up here on the upper right. The Final Fantasy games are much more about going through a sort of rogue set of motions over and over again to like reach a really, really high level. And skill plays a lesser role than it does in some of these like earlier hardcore American-style role-playing games. And similarly, you have sim games, like I think this is maybe Roller Coaster Tycoon, or maybe it's a Zoo Tycoon game on the bottom right. These games are also, you know, you watch something grow over time. There's not a chance that you're going to sort of like suddenly lose the game because of lack of skill, and there's not a lot of randomness involved either. And people have pointed this out about games like World of Warcraft as well. You know, how much time you put in the game in order to level your character up. That's really what determines whether you're going to succeed, even in a competition with another player. So why are these games so compelling? Like, why is labor as a mechanic? And then I'll get to why I call it that in a second. So this is Andrew Carnegie. And he's a sort of classic American figure who represents like this kind of bootstrap, rags to riches kind of story of success, right? He was the child of immigrants, grew up really poor, but then became a captain of industry. And this is sort of an American myth. And it's, you know, a myth in a lot of parts of the world that, you know, we kind of sell people on, you know, get people to come to this country. You know, the streets are paved with gold, right? You can just pick it up, flying around. And so my theory is that these games kind of operate on a similar principle. There's this fantasy that you're just going to be able to work hard and you'll get ahead and eventually you'll be rewarded. But the reason it's appealing as a fantasy is actually because it's extremely different to how work actually operates in the real world, right? There's immense inequality, you know, there are accidents of birth, you need resources to get higher education, and the world is extremely unpredictable. But inside this little bubble where you can just sort of work to grow the crops on your farm or level up your character, you're sort of guaranteed some measure of success just for persevering and putting your time in. And yeah, so World of Warcraft is a great example. And what's really interesting about massively multiplayer games is that this principle of labor has spread back out into the real world again, right? So people will pay an hourly wage to folks who are in East Asia, and because an hour put in by a player here in the United States is worth less on the worth more on the labor market than an hour by someone somewhere else in the world. So there's this booming industry of folks who are mostly young guys, 80% of them in China, many of them in Indonesia as well, who are being paid to sit and play World of Warcraft. And you have to wonder whether this is going to spread outside the hardcore gamer community and go on to these hundreds of millions of people playing Facebook
Who's
games
paying
as well.
them? Sorry, who's paying them?
Oh, okay. So the way this industry works is there are middleman companies that sort of pay these folks to earn large amounts of currency, or sort of contract out, like, oh, I want to pay to level a particular character up. But the players of the games, like,
so it's to level up your character.
Yeah, so level up your character, or it's to get just I can pay a middleman to sell me a lot of in-game currency. Like, 1,000 gold coins for 20 bucks. And so the middlemen are making a ton of money from players of the games who are mostly in Western Europe and the United States. And then and so those players don't actually have to put as much time in. It lets them obviate this sort of necessity of putting their own labor into getting ahead in the game.